According to law, all Americans should have equal access to housing. Should being the key word. Every year, April is designated as Fair Housing Month to shed some light on that. And sure, while it's worth celebrating how far housing equality in this country has come, we're still not there yet. So, how did we get here? The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was legislation meant to end housing discrimination and segregation that ran rampant for decades. The act meant landlords, banks, and any housing providers were now prohibited from denying people housing based on race, religion, sex, nationality, familial status, or disability. Great! Housing inequality solved, right? Well, let's look into that. There are about 6.5 million more homeowners now than in 2010, and because of the pandemic, 2020 had the fastest homeownership growth rate ever. But not for everyone. The homeownership rate for white Americans has hovered around 70% since 2017. That number is 11% lower for Asian Americans, 23% lower for Hispanic Americans, and 29% less for Black Americans. Black Americans are also the only group whose homeownership rate is lower than it was 10 years ago. So in 2020, the gap between Black and white homeownership only widened. If the U.S. believes in fair housing enough to dedicate a whole month to it, then how is that gap widening? Put simply, the Fair Housing Act made housing discrimination illegal, but that's not the same as making it disappear. The law meant that non-white Americans could bring those cases to court, which, good news, plenty of people continue to win those legal battles. But not everybody has the time or the resources for a lawsuit. So the Fair Housing Act sounds good on paper, but in reality, it's going to take a lot more to reach actual housing equality. But it would take a much longer video to cover all of that. Access to affordable housing isn't just about legality, it's also about resources. In the 1930s, neighborhoods were color-coded by residential security, a term loosely based on its age, condition, transportation access, economic class, and ethnic and racial composition. Good neighborhoods were green, while bad neighborhoods, typically Black and immigrant communities, were red, which is what's now known as redlining. Those red areas were too risky to insure, so getting a mortgage was near impossible, and building any type of equity or generational wealth was out of the question. Over the last 40 years, the average homeowner in a redlined neighborhood has 52% less personal wealth generated by property value than homeowners in green-lined neighborhoods. That's a whopping $212,000 less. What does that mean in a competitive real estate market today? A buyer that has an extra $50 to $100,000 from passed-down generational wealth has a clear advantage over those who don't. Do you see where we're going here? Good news! North Carolina has many housing organizations ready to help. Organizations like North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, North Carolina Housing Coalition, Find a Local Realtor, Housing Consultants Group, and North Carolina National Low-Income Housing Coalition. To stay on top of housing issues in North Carolina, follow us on nchomeownersalliance.org.